What if being single after 50 isn't about loneliness, but about freedom? Carl Jung believed this stage of life holds a hidden power, the chance to finally become who you were always meant to be. No more roles to play, no more expectations to fulfill, just you, your wisdom, and the opportunity for a deeper kind of happiness. Society often tells us that aging, especially alone, is something to fear. We're bombarded with messages that equate being single with being incomplete, as if our worth depends on partnership. But psychologist Carl Jung saw things differently. He argued that the second half of life is where true transformation begins. When the noise of external expectations fades, we're left with something far more valuable, the chance to rediscover ourselves. In this video, we'll explore Jung's wisdom on why being single after 50 can be a time of unparalleled empowerment. We'll break down his concepts of individuation and shadow work, uncover the freedom of solitude, and share practical ways to embrace this chapter with confidence. If you've ever wondered how to turn this phase of life into your most fulfilling one yet, this is for you. For Carl Jung, midlife wasn't something to fear. It was a turning point, a deeper calling. He saw life after 50 not as a decline, but as a shift from striving outwardly to exploring inwardly. At the center of this transformation is what he called individuation, the lifelong journey of bringing together all aspects of ourselves, both conscious and unconscious, to become whole and authentic. The first half of life often revolves around building careers, raising families, and meeting society's expectations. But beyond 50, a new question arises. Who am I when I'm no longer defined by the roles I've played? Individuation isn't about withdrawing or becoming self-centered. It's about facing the parts of ourselves we've buried or ignored, what Jung called the shadow, and learning to accept them. By this stage, many people have lived enough to see their patterns clearly, feel their regrets, and acknowledge their unfulfilled dreams. The pressure to seek approval or chase status often fades, making room for something deeper. What really matters now? What have I been hiding from myself to fit in? Jung believed that avoiding these questions leads to a kind of soul stagnation, while facing them sparks transformation. That's why your 50s and beyond can be the most powerful time for self-awareness. The noise of youth, the drive for recognition, the fear of judgment begins to quiet. For those who are single, the absence of partnership or parenting demands can offer rare freedom. There's space to explore long-lost passions, tend to old wounds, and rediscover purpose on your own terms. Jung once said, "Life really begins at 40. Until then, you are just doing research." And by 50, that research prepares you for a choice. Continue repeating old patterns or step into conscious evolution. Yet society often overlooks this stage, painting it as a time of loneliness or decline, especially for single women and men. Jung, however, saw it as a sacred opportunity to shed the borrowed identities we've worn for decades and finally live from within. A divorced woman might find joy in painting again after years of caregiving. A widower might at last allow himself to grieve after a lifetime of distraction through work. These aren't endings, they're initiations into a more meaningful life. The real shift is understanding that fulfillment now comes from within. While earlier years might have been about seeking love or validation outside ourselves, Jung's wisdom reminds us that true contentment is born from self-integration. That doesn't mean turning away from relationships. It means entering them or embracing solitude from a place of inner completeness. As Jung beautifully put it, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And after 50, that privilege becomes not just possible, but essential. Carl Jung saw solitude not as loneliness, but as sacred space, a necessary condition for psychological and spiritual maturation. In his own life, Jung built a stone tower at Balingen where he would retreat for weeks at a time, deliberately stepping away from his roles as psychiatrist, husband, and public figure to reconnect with his inner world. This intentional solitude wasn't an escape from life, but rather a deeper engagement with it. He believed that only in quiet aloneness could we hear the whispers of our authentic selves beneath the cacophony of daily obligations and social expectations. For those single after 50, this understanding transforms what society often frames as a lack into a profound opportunity. The gift of time becomes particularly precious in this stage of life. Without the constant demands of parenting or the compromises required by partnership, there emerges space for the kind of self-reflection that earlier years may have crowded out. Many carry into midlife unfinished emotional business, unresolved grief from lost relationships, unprocessed regrets about career paths not taken, or lingering wounds from childhood that were never properly tended. Solitude provides the container where these long-avoided feelings can finally be acknowledged and integrated. Jung warned that what we refuse to confront consciously will control us unconsciously, and the single life after 50 offers ideal conditions for this essential psychological work. There is also tremendous liberation in the shedding of roles that occurs naturally at this stage. The masks we've worn for decades, as dutiful child, responsible parent, accommodating partner, or ambitious professional, begin to feel less necessary. Society may initially view this disidentification as a loss, but Jung recognized it as a gain. A woman no longer defined primarily as mother can rediscover aspects of herself she set aside decades ago. A man no longer chasing career advancement can explore parts of his personality that the corporate world discouraged. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of the second half of life being about recovering the self you were before the world told you who you should be. With this freedom from external definitions comes permission to reconnect with suppressed passions. Many people in their 50s and beyond report returning to creative pursuits they abandoned in youth, painting, writing, music, or other forms of expression that once brought them joy but were deemed impractical. Others discover entirely new interests that align with their current values rather than those imposed by earlier life circumstances. Jung saw this reawakening of creativity not as a mere hobby, but as vital to psychological health, a way for the unconscious to communicate its wisdom through symbols and imagination. The single life provides both the time and mental space for this creative reconnection to flourish. Perhaps most importantly, solitude allows for the development of what Jung called a relationship with oneself. Many people spend their first 50 years seeking validation and completion through others, partners, children, colleagues, or social circles. While human connection remains important, the post-50 years offer the chance to establish an inner foundation that isn't dependent on external affirmation. This isn't about rejecting relationships, but rather about entering them from a place of wholeness rather than neediness. Jung observed that until we make the unconscious conscious, we will call it fate and remain its prisoner. The solitude of single life after 50 provides the ideal conditions for this liberating self-knowledge to emerge. The journey into wholeness after 50 inevitably leads us to confront what Carl Jung called our shadow, those disowned parts of ourselves we've repressed, denied, or projected onto others throughout our lives. Being single creates the perfect psychological container for this essential shadow work, offering both the space and the necessity to face what we may have avoided in busier, more outwardly focused years. Without the distraction of managing a partner's needs or the buffer of constant companionship, we're left alone with our inner world in a way that can feel uncomfortable at first, but ultimately proves transformative. Jung taught that the shadow isn't our enemy, but rather a treasure trove of unlived potential, the creative energies, authentic emotions, and vital aspects of personality we buried under layers of shoulds and expectations. For the single person in midlife, shadow work becomes not just therapeutic work, but sacred work, reclaiming the full spectrum of who we are. Past relationships often leave behind emotional baggage that we carry unconsciously into new connections, the fears from a painful divorce, the insecurities from childhood abandonment, or the defensive patterns developed in previous partnerships. Solitude provides the rare opportunity to unpack this baggage thoroughly rather than simply transferring it to another person. Without the immediate prospect of a new romance, We're forced to examine our relationship patterns with clear eyes. What Jung called the animus, or anima, the inner masculine and feminine aspects we typically project onto partners, can now be recognized and integrated within ourselves. This process allows us to approach future relationships, should we choose them, from a place of wholeness rather than neediness. The single state becomes not a waiting room for the next partner, but a workshop for psychological integration. There's profound liberation in realizing, as Jung did, that completeness comes from within. Our culture persistently sells the myth that we need romantic partnership to be whole, but this belief keeps us trapped in dependency. The midlife single person has the unique opportunity to disprove this myth experientially. As we do the work of integrating our shadow, embracing our anger along with our kindness, our vulnerability along with our strength, our darkness along with our light, we discover an astonishing truth: we contain multitudes. The parts of ourselves we once sought in others were within us all along, waiting to be acknowledged. This doesn't mean living without human connection, but rather entering relationships as a full participant rather than as someone searching for their missing pieces in another. Jung's concept of the self, as opposed to the ego, points toward this greater wholeness that emerges when we stop identifying with just one narrow slice of our personality. For the single person after 50, the process of self-realization can unfold with particular depth and clarity. Without the daily negotiations and compromises of partnership, there's more room to explore the full range of our being, to try on different ways of thinking, feeling, and expressing that might have felt off-limits in earlier, more conventional stages of life. The accumulated wisdom of 5 decades gives us the perspective to see our patterns clearly, while the freedom of singlehood gives us space to change them. What might look from the outside like loneliness is often, in truth, the fertile void from which authentic selfhood emerges. This journey toward wholeness inevitably involves grieving the idealized versions of ourselves and our lives that we've held onto. The single person at midlife may need to mourn certain dreams of perfect love, of flawless family, of uninterrupted happiness. Yet, as Jung reminds us, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. The gift of this painful awakening is the discovery of something more real and enduring than fantasy, an authentic relationship with oneself that forms the foundation for all other healthy relationships. When we stop expecting another person to complete us, we begin the more rewarding work of completing ourselves. This is perhaps the greatest empowerment of being single after 50, the chance to become, at last, who we were always meant to be, not in relation to someone else, but in glorious, complex, ever-unfolding relation to ourselves. There is a quiet revolution that happens when a person crosses the threshold of 50 and finds themselves single, not by circumstance, but by choice or by the natural unfolding of life. This phase becomes less about what has been lost and more about what can be gained. A profound sense of independence that is both financial and emotional. Financial self-sufficiency in midlife carries a different weight than it did in younger years. By this stage, many have paid off mortgages, built careers, or simplified their needs to align with deeper values rather than societal expectations. There is empowerment in knowing that your stability isn't tied to anyone else's presence or approval. For some, this might mean the freedom to travel spontaneously. For others, it's the ability to invest in long-delayed passions or education. The financial independence that often comes with age allows single individuals to design their lives on their own terms, free from the compromises that partnership sometimes demands. Emotional self-sufficiency is equally transformative. After decades of navigating relationships, whether romantic, familial, or professional, there comes a point when the need for external validation diminishes. This isn't to say connection isn't valued. Rather, it's no longer the scaffolding that holds one's sense of worth together. Jungian psychology teaches that true maturity involves developing an inner dialogue strong enough to replace the constant seeking of reassurance from others. For the single person post-50, this emotional autonomy means the ability to enjoy one's own company without loneliness, to sit with difficult feelings without rushing to distract or numb them, and to make decisions based on inner guidance rather than external pressure. The result is a quieter, steadier kind of confidence, one that doesn't need to announce itself but is evident in the way life is lived. With this independence comes a rediscovery of autonomy and creativity that may have been dormant for years. Without the need to accommodate another person's preferences daily, small choices, what to eat, how to spend a weekend, whether to move cities, become acts of self-expression. For many, this is the time when suppressed creative impulses resurface. A former accountant starts painting, a retired teacher writes poetry, a divorced father reconnects with his love of woodworking. These aren't just hobbies, they're reclamations of identity. Jung believed that creativity is the soul's language, and in the spaciousness of singlehood, that language finally gets room to speak. The autonomy to structure one's days without negotiation means that time can be spent exactly as one chooses, whether in productivity or rest, socializing or solitude. Real-life stories bear this out. Take Margaret, who divorced at 55 after a 30-year marriage and discovered that solitude allowed her to hear her own thoughts for the first time in decades. She went back to school for botany, a passion she'd abandoned in her 20s to raise a family, and now leads nature walks in her community. Or James, a widower who at 60 began traveling alone, not to escape grief, but to meet himself anew in unfamiliar places. Then there's Priya, who never married and once feared she'd missed out, only to realize in her late 50s that her independence had given her the freedom to build a thriving ceramic studio and a chosen family of deep friendships. These individuals aren't exceptions. They're examples of what becomes possible when societal scripts about aging and singlehood are rewritten. This stage of life offers something rare, the chance to define success on your own terms. For some, that means a minimalist apartment and mornings spent reading. For others, it's a bustling social calendar or a late-in-life career pivot. The common thread is autonomy, the understanding that fulfillment doesn't require a partner's presence, but flourishes in the space where self-knowledge and freedom meet. As Jung noted, the second half of life is about quality, not quantity, depth, not surface. And for those single after 50, that depth is often found in the quiet assurance that comes from standing firmly in one's own life, unapologetically and without need for witness. The reward isn't just independence, it's the realization that you are, and always have been, enough. Carl Jung drew a crucial distinction between two experiences often confused in modern life: loneliness and aloneness. Loneliness, he observed, stems from a feeling of lack, an anxious sense that something or someone is missing to make us whole. It's rooted in fear and often tied to what Jung called our collective shadow, the societal conditioning that tells us we're incomplete without partnership. Aloneness, by contrast, is what happens when we turn toward ourselves with curiosity rather than avoidance. It's the fertile ground where true self-relationship takes root. For those single after 50, recognizing this difference becomes transformative. Loneliness shouts that we're lacking. Aloneness whispers that we're meeting ourselves anew. One depletes us, while the other, when embraced, becomes the soil where unexpected growth occurs. The shift from fearing solitude to valuing it often happens through what Jung termed the middle passage of life. Where younger years might have been spent fleeing alone time through constant activity or serial relationships, midlife presents the opportunity to discover what actually lives within us when the noise stops. This isn't about glorifying isolation, but about reclaiming the ability to be comfortably alone, a skill our hyper-connected culture has nearly erased. Many discover that what they once called loneliness was actually unfamiliarity with their own company. As Jungian analyst James Hollis puts it, the first half of life is about collecting identities. The second half is about releasing them. In that releasing, we find that aloneness isn't empty, it's rich with a presence we've finally learned to offer ourselves. Cultivating meaningful connections from this place requires what Jung called relatedness, the ability to engage with others while maintaining one's own center. This differs dramatically from dependency, where relationships function as crutches for unmet inner needs. The self-sufficient single person in their 50s and beyond often becomes capable of relationships Jung would describe as conscious, interactions where two whole people choose each other rather than cling from need. These connections might look different from earlier bonds. Deeper friendships where vulnerability isn't feared, chosen family that transcends biology, or romantic relationships entered with clear eyes rather than hungry hearts. The key is that these connections enhance rather than define one's existence. Practical wisdom emerges for those navigating this balance. First, honoring the need for genuine connection while discerning between filling voids and sharing abundance. A weekly coffee with a close friend where both people show up authentically feeds the soul more than constant socializing with acquaintances. Second, developing what Jung called the transcendent function. The ability to hold opposites, like connection and solitude, without rejecting either. This might mean scheduling regular alone time even while maintaining an active social circle. Third, recognizing that some loneliness isn't pathology but growing pains, the discomfort of outgrowing old relational patterns that no longer serve. As Jung warned, there is no birth of consciousness without pain. The alchemy occurs when solitude becomes not something to endure between relationships, but a valued state in itself. This is where many single people in midlife discover an unexpected gift, the ability to be alone without being lonely, and to be together without losing themselves. Jung's psychology reminds us that true connection with others begins with connection to oneself. For those who've done their inner work, relationships become choices rather than necessities, a subtle but profound shift that transforms everything from friendships to community ties. In this space, singlehood after 50 reveals its secret. It's not a waiting room for partnership, but a masterclass in learning how to belong to oneself while still embracing the world. The transition into singlehood after 50 presents a unique opportunity to consciously design a life of purpose and authenticity. One of the most powerful tools for this journey is journaling, particularly when guided by prompts that excavate buried truths. Try asking yourself, what parts of myself did I silence to please others, and how can I welcome them back now? Or, if no one's expectations mattered, how would I spend my days? These questions aren't merely reflective, they're revolutionary, dismantling decades of conditioned responses. Another potent prompt: what childhood joy did I abandon that still whispers to me? The answers often reveal forgotten passions waiting to be reclaimed. Jung believed writing to the self was a form of active imagination, a dialogue with the unconscious. For the newly single, this practice becomes a compass, pointing toward desires that may have been suppressed in partnership. As these inner discoveries emerge, they create space for new hobbies and spiritual practices that resonate with who you're becoming rather than who you once were. This isn't about filling time, it's about following energy. Where a younger version of yourself might have taken up activities to meet people or check societal boxes, now you can choose what genuinely calls to you. Perhaps it's learning pottery, where the tactile experience grounds you in the present, or studying astronomy, which reconnects you with wonder. Spiritual exploration often deepens in this stage too, whether through meditation, a practice Jung incorporated from Eastern traditions, forest bathing, or joining a philosophy discussion group. The key is to listen for what stirs curiosity rather than imposing shoulds. A divorced accountant might discover unexpected joy in flamenco dancing. A widowed teacher might find peace in daily sketching. These aren't distractions from singlehood, they're doorways into its gifts. Yet humans are wired for connection, and building a community that aligns with your evolving values is crucial. It just looks different now. Instead of defaulting to traditional social circles, this is the time to be intentional. Seek out groups centered around growth, book clubs that discuss Jung's work, volunteer organizations addressing causes you care about, or travel communities for solo explorers. The magic happens when you stop trying to recreate the relationships of your past and instead allow new bonds to form around current interests. A 58-year-old who joins a hiking group might find unexpected kinship with people decades older or younger, connections that wouldn't have occurred in the age-segregated contexts of earlier life. Technology offers surprising avenues too, from online courses with discussion forums to apps connecting platonic travel companions. The quality of connection matters more than quantity. One or two kindred spirits who get this chapter of your life can be more nourishing than a dozen superficial ties. What makes these steps truly transformative is their cumulative effect. Journaling clarifies your desires, new hobbies embody them, and community supports the process, creating an upward spiral of self-discovery. A woman who journals about her youthful love of biology might take a local nature course, meet like-minded learners, and eventually co-lead conservation efforts. A man who rediscovers his spiritual curiosity through writing might join a meditation group, then organize interfaith dialogues. This isn't about crafting a perfect life, but an authentic one, where even the stumbles become part of the adventure. Jung reminded us that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. For the single person over 50, these practical steps aren't just activities. They're rituals of self-acceptance, each one whispering, "Your life isn't over, it's just becoming truly your own." The beauty of this approach lies in its flexibility. Some days, empowerment might look like journaling over morning coffee. Others, it's saying no to draining social obligations without guilt. Some weeks you'll immerse in a new skill, others you'll rest deeply without apology. The thread running through it all is conscious choice, the antithesis of living on autopilot. As these practices accumulate, something alchemical occurs. Singlehood stops being a status and becomes a sacred space. Not a waiting room for what's next, but a studio where you're both the artist and the masterpiece in progress. Jung believed that in the second half of life, we're meant to trade the false security of external definitions for the truer security of self-knowledge. These practical steps light that path. One honest page, one curious exploration, one authentic connection at a time. As we've explored, being single after 50 isn't an ending. It's an invitation to begin again, this time with the wisdom of your years as your guide. Carl Jung's teachings illuminate this path, from the liberating process of individuation, where you reclaim lost parts of yourself, to the transformative power of shadow work that turns past wounds into wisdom. We've seen how solitude can become sacred space rather than emptiness, how financial and emotional independence create new possibilities, and how meaningful connections flourish when they're chosen from wholeness rather than need. The practical tools, journaling, new passions, intentional community, aren't just ways to pass time, but rituals of self-reclamation. Your 50s and beyond can be the start of your most authentic chapter yet, a time when societal shoulds lose their grip, and what remains is the freedom to become who you truly are. This isn't about denying the challenges of aging or romanticizing solitude, but about recognizing the unique gifts this phase offers: the clarity to distinguish loneliness from nourishing aloneness, the courage to face your shadows, and the creativity to design a life that reflects your deepest values. Jung's wisdom reminds us that the second half of life isn't a decline. It's an ascent to a truer, more expansive way of being. Now we'd love to hear from you. Which Jungian idea resonates most with your journey? Is it the call to individuation, the power of shadow work, or the freedom found in solitude? Share your thoughts below. Your insights might light the way for others on this path. And if this perspective has shifted how you view your singlehood, consider passing it along to someone who needs this reminder that life after 50 isn't a winding down, but a profound awakening to the self you've always been meant to meet. The adventure continues, and it's yours to shape.